And I give that. Okay, so sorry, I was a bit surprised by the by the message that came here. So now I can start speaking good. So hi, I'm Fred Serval. I'm very happy to be here tonight to talk about the complexity of simplicity, and maybe a bit more specifically, what I want to talk about tonight is an overall reflection on what I think is a board game's design footprint, and I will explain a bit more what I think, what I mean about that. But the first thing that I would like to do is, first of all, thanks Sebastian for inviting me. I've been enjoying the video that the Wargaming Society has been putting out on YouTube for quite a while now. So it's very much an honor to be here, but I'm also super excited to interact with all of the students here, but also the people that are coming, not necessarily from Georgetown, but in general, just to discuss this topic. So thanks a lot for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. I'm going to start maybe briefly by introducing myself, who I am. So in real life, I'm a statistics director in a big Danish toy company. My background is in history and political science. But I think it's really important to explain that I'm not an academic, so I don't have a PhD in anything. My daily life is not linked to research in any kind, and the work that I do, even though it's in a toy company, is very separate from my activity as a gamer and a designer. On the more personal side and relationship with wargaming and historical gaming in general, I discovered tabletop wargaming in 2015 when I played a game that some of you might know called Twilight Struggle that I think in a way changed my life. And in 2018, I started a YouTube channel, and in 2021, I published my first game with GMT Games. So I'm touching at different parts of the community and different aspects of what wargaming is. So the first thing that I think more importantly, what's taking most of my time is content creation. I have a YouTube show that's called Homo Ludens. We also started a podcast recently. So you can find me on YouTube if we search for it, and you can have monthly podcasts where we have debriefs and also talk about games that we've been talking with the rest of the Homo Ludens backer community, and also write reviews in different magazines and mostly in a magazine called Battles Magazine that used to be probably the best wargaming magazine that there was, but its publishing schedule has now disappeared a bit. Like we've been waiting for issue number 15 for a couple of years now, so I'm not sure it's going to come back, but let's hope it will. And then aside from content creation, what I do is game design, which is the other thing that I do quite a lot when it comes to wargaming. So as I was saying, my first game was published in late 2021. It's called Red Flag Over Paris, and it was published by GMT Games. And it's a game on the insurrection of the Paris Commune in 1871. Before that, even though it was designed after, I released the print and play in 2021, also called Gravelotte 1870 on the Franco-Prussian War and the Battle of Gravelotte-Saint-Privat. And currently I have in pre-order a game called The Jest of Robin Hood, also with GMT, that is portraying Robin Hood and Merriman's activities as you could say guerrilla activities. So it's portraying it as an insurgency versus counter-insurgency model. So that's what I do as game designs, or the game designs that are currently working on, even though there are a lot of other ones, but those are the ones that are available or in pre-order. And aside from this, and I think that's something that's going to be relevant to that discussion today, and that's why I want to talk about it. I was also the co-founder of an event that's called the Consim Game Jam. The Consim Game Jam is an event that is inspired by video game jams that anyone can attend. So I would actually recommend the people who are watching this to look into this, because I think you might be interested in that. And the idea is that people from all around the world register and then spend 3 days together and trying to make a historical board game in a weekend. So edition number 1 was in 2020, and the concept of that edition was you take a coin game and you recycle it. So you take all of its components, but you make a completely new game out of it. It doesn't even have to be a coin game. Edition number 2 just happened a few months ago, And the idea of this one was to make a card-driven card game. So you make a card-driven game in the sense that Path of Glory, Twilight Struggle, something like this, but that only uses cards as components. And this edition was also pretty much of a success. So we had a lot of fun over there. It's a really fun thing to do. And just as a quick note, we're pretty proud to see that of the edition 1, 3 of those games have been picked up for publishing. So In the Shadows, Vijaya Nagara, and Rebellion Britannia are not currently on GMT's P500 pre-order system. And I'm pretty sure that a few games of edition 2 are going to be picked up by different publishers. So keep an eye out for that and register if you want to participate in a future session. So that's about me and my activities. And now I want to talk a bit more about the purpose of the session that we're having today. So when I reached out to Sebastian, I told him that one of the topics that I would like to cover if I were to come to the Georgetown University Wargame Society was to talk about something that I'm very much aware of when I work as a designer, and that's the game design footprint. So this idea that game design takes a specific space in a player's life and thinking about that space in a more systematic way. And the thing that I want to just really be sure that I'm clear before we start talking about this is I don't have, this is not a formal academic presentation. The experience that I'm bringing here is practical game design experience. I'm not a researcher. Even when I was studying, I didn't have anything specific working on design, product design, or game design. I didn't work in ludology or anything. So my objective here is really to share some thoughts, practical thoughts, based on my experience as a player and a designer, and actually spark conversation. And that's what I would say my objective, my personal objective that I have of being here is to say, this is my intuitions. Those were the things that I've been thinking about. And actually, I would like to start an exchange, spark those conversation, and see if within that process, I can refine my thinking, but also maybe inspire others to think a bit more in depth about some of those intuitions that I've had regarding the footprint. And so that's really the idea. Originally, I had said that I thought that game designs had 3 footprints: temporal footprint, spatial footprint, and a cognitive footprint. And that was the original pitch, and that's probably what you've read when you were looking at the description of that presentation. And all this was a lie. So it's not a lie, it's just that in the process of having had to actually make the presentation and think about it and spend some time really reflecting on that idea, I realized that 3 was probably too small, and I actually expanded my view on what is the design footprint. It's probably even more complex than what I'm presenting here, but the opportunity was for me in the process of making the presentation to refine all of those ideas that I had and making them a bit more complex and a bit more rich, I hope. So yeah, sparking a conversation. That being said, I think we'll probably, just for simplicity's sake, keep the questions for the end of the presentation. But at the end, I will also give ways for you to reach out if you want to keep on having that discussion, because for me, that's really the purpose of just starting something and talk about this game design footprint and what does it mean for designers and players. That being said, maybe I should start by defining what I mean by a board game footprint in a bit more detail, even if I'm going to go even more detail in the rest of the presentation, but just so that you have a general idea of what I'm going for. So when I'm thinking about the design footprint, what I'm thinking about is 2 things. So I think that there are 2 types of footprints that a game can have. There is a material side and an abstract side. I'm not sure that abstract is the perfect word here, but the idea is there. Everything that relates to the material footprint relates to the physical aspect of the game for me. So that's going to be irrespective of the player. And that's the thing, when you're playing a board game, it's an interaction between a physical object and a human subject. And some of that footprint is going to be more on the physical object. The other is more going to be on the subject. And the material footprint relates really just to that physical, materialistic approach of what the game is. And then you have this abstract footprint that is going to relate to the subject. So the person who's receiving the game, internalizing it and interacting with it. And when you think about those 2 sides of the footprint, the overall footprint is the overall footprint of the game design. And I'm going to divide that presentation in 2, and I'm going to go through the 3 dimension of the material footprints and then the 3 dimension of the abstract footprint. And we'll go in a bit more detail, but this is what's going to structure my reflection. Why I think it's important to think about those things as a designer is that I think that something that we need to keep in mind when we're designing games is that there is an asymmetry in the way that the game is perceived between the designer and the player. So here I'm talking about something that's called the MDA framework. This is probably something that you already know. And if you don't, I would really recommend reading the article about it by Robin Hunicke, Marc Leblanc, and Robert Zubek. And it's called MDA, A Formal Approach to Game Design and Game Research. And it explains this in a lot more details and explains how within the game design process, this is important to keep in mind. But overall, the idea behind that asymmetry is that the designer perceives the game in different way than the player. And a game is, you could see, probably has three layers, a bit like an onion, where you have at the core mechanics. Those mechanics or what are the basic systemic components of the game. Those mechanics interacting with each other actually create dynamics and actually provide the game dynamic that says, okay, what behavior are rewarded, what is effective, what is not effective. And then on top of that, you have an additional layer that is the aesthetic layer. So the aesthetic layer is everything that is going to be the sensation that the game is going to provide, that is going to be what narrative the game is building, what challenges it's proposing to the player, and what type of ludic experience in general. Is it a collaborative game? Is it a competitive game? And all this. The thing is that as a designer, you probably think about when you're making the game, mechanics, what mechanics you're using, what type of dynamic you want to build, and you go from mechanics up toward aesthetics. So your relationship with the game is slightly different than from the player, because the player interacts with the aesthetics of the game first, then understands its dynamics, and then realizes how the different mechanics are interconnected together. And this is the asymmetry in the ludic experience here between the designer on one hand and the player on the other hand makes it challenging for, I think, the game designer to really evaluate the footprint of their game design during the process in an intuitive way. And this is where I think that we shouldn't probably, as designers, make a conscious effort to actually evaluate this. And that conscious effort for me goes by identifying what are those aspects of those footprints and maybe find a way to measure it. And this is going to be the purpose of that discussion. There is one thing that I want to say that I think is pretty important, is that there is nothing inherently good or bad about having a game having a larger or narrower footprint. It's just decisions that are made by the designer depending on their game design objective. It's just that what I'm saying is not that we should reduce the footprint at all costs. What I'm saying is that we should be conscious about what the footprint is and what we are, as designer, using it for. And I would say that usually what I expect and what I see, and I think that's normal, is that historical board game design tend to have a larger footprint because they are a bit more complex, because they are not just providing a gameplay experience, they're often trying to interact with the history that they are depicting. They are trying to convey more complex ideas than just a pure ludic interaction. But that doesn't really matter. It's just that I just want to clarify that it's not good or bad. What I would say is what a good game designer should be trying is not reducing or expanding their footprint, but trying to optimize as much as possible the footprint that they are giving their design to actually maximize the effect of the experience they are trying to create. So this is the purpose of this discussion. Good. Now that this is being said, well, to go a bit more into something specific, we're going to first talk about the material part of the footprint. And here there are three different aspects of the material footprint of a game design. And I would say that those footprints are usually positively correlated, meaning that if one is big, usually the other ones would tend to be big also. And they are a key aspect to consider when you're thinking as a designer, when you're thinking about where you expect the game to be played. And those material footprints are pretty straightforward. The first one is the temporal footprint. So, and this is the structure that I would have for all of those aspects or dimensions of the footprint. Is I would give a short definition, talk about what I think are the benefits and risks of that footprint, and then give a couple of examples, usually of high footprints, so you can really understand what I'm saying, and also talk about how potentially a designer can play with the footprint of that specific dimension. So the first one, temporal, pretty straightforward. That's literally the length that it takes to play the game. But we have to think about it in a broader sense, not just the length of a section, but actually the of a session, but actually the length of learning the game, teaching the rules potentially to an opponent, setting up the game, and the actual gameplay. So thinking about it as a whole. And I think this is important because if some of you play a lot of Hex Encounters games, for example, you might have the experience of pretty lengthy setup sessions. And I think this is something that we need also to take into account when we're thinking about the temporal footprint of a game. So what I think the benefits are of having a large temporal footprint for a game is that longer playtime, they usually enable the designer to build more complex narrative. So if you want to have something that is a bit more refined, that has like a sort of like multiple narrative arcs, and you have ups and downs, and a specific faction can go through different types of situation and have to adapt, like giving maybe rewarding more long-term planning to versus short-term planning, and all those kind of things. Anything that is around more complex model, well, the temporal footprint is going to help the designer to actually integrate all of those elements within their game. So it's going to enable to give a more a richer experience to the players. But on the other side, you have quite a few risks with a large temporal footprint. The first one is attention loss. So asking players to play for a long time, it's really hard to stay concentrated for too long, especially when you're engaged in a game, and a game requires a lot of attention. So when you're thinking about sessions that are going to last 5 to 6 hours and potentially are going to be repeated over multiple days, well, you're going to have like, it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle to make sure that people are still engaged, that players are still attentive. You also increase the social cost, and I'm going to talk about the social dimension a bit later, but basically you're going to ask from people to dedicate more of their free time to something specific, and games are usually in competition with any other form of free time that we have. Unfortunately, we don't have unlimited free time, and this cost is actually can be a bit of a problem for that. You also have create less opportunity to play, and that's also something that might be a risk if you want your game to be repeated because of a specific use that you think for it. Well, the length of it is going to make sure that the repeated gameplay is not going to be potentially possible. Typical example of high footprint, I think campaign for North Africa is comically long, and the legend says that actually no one in playtest fully played it, and probably no players actually completely fully played the campaign. So that's one of the example of very high footprints. And the way that you can play with that footprint is actually maybe scenario-based systems or stuff like this, enable you to have provide to your players different experiences with the game, but maybe narrowing the experience on a specific area that you want to focus on the topic, and maybe giving them touch by touch, a bit like in an impressionistic manner, an overview of what the game has to offer, but in smaller sessions. The second one, also pretty obvious, is the spatial footprint. So here is just technically the physical space that a game takes. And here I also want to take into account, well, how much space do you need to play the game, but also potentially to store it. And here the idea is that, well, there are a lot of benefits of having a large footprint. One of them is you increase immersion. That's one of the things, but also you increase the illusion of movement. So when you have a large map, for example, you're going to feel like you have more control over the minutiae of how you want your units to move on a map, or how you want your influence to be spread across. Like you have more, maybe potentially you have more space for more option. The board can be more readable. So you have a lot of benefits for the spatial footprint. But then you have just a very tangible problem, is that players in different parts of the world don't have access to the same space. And I think I'm usually saying is that comparing people living in the US to people living in EU cities. For example, myself, I'm living in London. Well, the size of my apartment makes it so that there are literally some games that I have in my collection that I cannot physically play because I don't have physically enough space in the place that I live to be actually able to engage with the game. So that's one of the thing. The other thing is that you might dilute actually real decision making by providing too much geographical details. So you might actually make the process of moving your units across the board a bit more tedious than it needs to be, and you actually maybe may take more steps for creating that illusion of movement, but actually make less relevant decisions. And that's probably something that we'll talk about later in that presentation. And then you can also have gaming mechanics. So the more you rely on the space that you create on the board, the more maybe you create options for oddities in your depiction, because every geographical representation is an abstraction, and you potentially create some gaps in the way you represent the space by adding more detail. Example of high footprint, I'm talking about OCS Case Blue. OCS is a series of hex and counter games that not all of them are really big, but Case Blue is actually pretty big. Like you have 3 full maps. And I think the picture you had at the beginning of that section was from an OCS Case Blue game. So it's a very, very large map. It's really hard to play. It takes a lot of time. And as I said, positively correlated with the temporal footprint. Usually the bigger a game is, the longer it's going to be to interact with its components, the longer the game sessions are going to be. But you can play with this dimension in a lot of different ways. I think one of the ways that I think is really interesting is by abstracting geography. And here you have a picture of Pax Renaissance, but I just want to show you so you really realize what I mean. Like Pax Renaissance literally holds in my hand, and that's like the amount of history that it covers and the geography that it covers, like all of Europe, Turkey, North Africa is all there, and everything is card based. So you can actually have very large spaces for very large period that are covered in a very small, tight, neat little package. The other thing that you can do is maybe have specific maps for scenarios or specific subboards or different components that you can actually move around to let the players more flexibility in how they organize their game space. And then the last material footprint is the social footprint. And here, what I'm saying, what I'm meaning, what I'm talking about, the social footprint is how much does the game rely on social structures? And here it's a bit of more of a bundled dimension compared to others. But what I'm taking into account is different things like income, community, groups, and everything. So what we're considering here is what's going to be the player count, what is going to be the level of involvement that you're going to ask from other players that are maybe not knowing and owning the game, how many sessions are required to play the game, what's the game's cost, does it require specific storage, and everything. Here the benefits, also pretty straightforward. It's also the same idea as the spatial one, is that the social, the higher the social footprints, maybe the more complex the interactions are going to be. Board games or social activities, so the more you have players, the more time you're spending together, the more rich the experience is going to be possible. And you're going to also provide maybe a lot more immersion. The risk that you have here is that maybe the games are going to be less inclusive, and ability to play or to play testing are going to be more complex. Example of high footprint, I would say, so you have a picture of Twilight Imperium 4 here. I think this is a good example, but then I would say any miniature war game is an excellent example of very high footprints. And why I'm thinking about miniature war games is that you do rely on quite a lot of like economical investment to create an army. And also the thing is that the space that is required, the fact that you need buildings, different scenarios and everything. And this is why you would see a lot of miniature gamers actually organizing clubs as soon as they start playing, is that the social footprint is so high that they need to work together as players to actually create those spaces, those moments, and share some of the cost to being able to play those games. And an example of a low footprint game would be any print and play game that you can find on BGG. You have a lot of different ways to play with that footprint. And the first of one is pretty obvious, but that's going to be variable player count. So if you have a game that offers different player counts, you're going to be able to play with this. Maybe you can create learn to play scripts to make actually the social cost of learning people or teaching people the game a bit lower. And then you can have potentially entry level versions of your game and something like this. Here, an example that I have in mind is, I don't know if you play miniature war games, but there is miniature wargaming system that's called Blucher. That is a miniature war games that actually works with cards. And technically, you could start playing Blucher with just a set of cards, not even any terrain. It can be a drawn map. And then you can actually work your way through a full, maybe minis wargaming experience. So you have a lot of range to, or a lot of ways to actually play with that footprint. And those are the most obvious one. So those are the material footprints. Those shouldn't be really mind-blowing, but I think it's really important to think about what you're asking from your players. And I think this has a really big impact for the type of experience that you're trying to offer, especially if you're trying to play within an academic context or at school or in different clubs, or what you're hoping your game to be used to. Thinking about those, I think, should be a base level of reflection. What I would like to talk about now is more the abstract footprint that I think can be more complex to evaluate, but it's probably more important to think about. And before talking about the abstract footprint, there is a couple of things that I want to talk about. And the first thing is a concept that I called design sedimentation. And it's a bit of a weird word, but I think it's something interesting to think about when you are a game designer. And design sedimentation is the idea that game design is created within a socio-cultural context, and that has an historical becoming. So you had a gradual process of abstraction and stabilization that created the toolbox of all the mechanics that we use today. The idea is that you're never creating anything. You're always creating something within a specific context that you were exposed to. And this creates the context of mechanics that you have been exposed to, that you know how to use. So as both as a designer and as a player, it creates a socio-cultural context of what you expect a game to do. And those mechanics, or like any other form of culturally inherited practices, like you could see languages or politeness norms and stuff like this, and those patterns are internalized by the players and the designers within their own specific context. So you don't learn how to game or play or design in a vacuum. You're exposed to the sediment that you are surrounded with. And those conventions are the basis of any game design innovation. So design innovation is not out of nowhere. It's always based on those sediments. They do it when you make a game, when I make a game, when any designer make a game, they make it on top of centuries of inherited conventions and other game design and other experiences that they've had. And their work in turn, once it's out there and it's being played, starts to become part of that overall sediment. And this has an impact is that different people are going to be exposed to different things and going to have different types of relationship with different types of mechanics. And just to illustrate this, because this is maybe a bit abstract and a bit weird, but just to make it very concrete, I'm going to give a very simple example: cards. Everyone knows cards. Most of the culture play cards. But the thing is that the sediment for me, a French person that come from the southwest of France, so Southern Europe, my relationship with card is widely different than someone who would live in Japan or in Korea. So on one hand, you have so this is a set of tarot that you see on the left, so which is a very classic trick-taking game that exists in the north of Italy and the south of France. And you have some variants that exist also in Spain and in different areas of Southern Europe. Most of them work the same way. They just might have different cards and everything. But basically, I grew up in an environment where playing trick-taking games was something completely normal. I've been used to it. And you give me any trick-taking game now, whatever the innovation that it has or anything, I will have an instinctive understanding of how the game works, of its dynamics, of its mechanics. It would be very clear and more transparent to me. I would not have the same relationship as a player who comes from Korea, for example. On the other hand, if you look at Korean or Japanese card games, even though they are cards, the way they are used is widely different. You don't have 4 suits, you have 12. You don't have 13 or 14 values, you have 4. The values might be different by suits. And the way you interact with the game is very different than making a trick. You actually play a card, draw a card, try to make a combination with cards that are available to other players on the board. The overall mechanics and dynamics are really, really different. And when I'm trying to figure out how to play a Japanese or a Korean card game, it is extremely difficult because it's an uphill battle for me because I didn't grow up within that context. It is hard for me to grasp, even though it might feel very obvious. So on one hand, you have that sediment, this idea that we didn't grow up in the same areas and we were not exposed to the same thing. And the other thing is that not all of players have the same ludic cultural capital. So this idea that all of us have a different ludic cultural capital is based on the sociology professor called Pierre Bourdieu that you see here on the right-hand side, which is a French philosopher that came up with this concept of cultural capital, but we can apply it to gaming. And the idea is that each player comes with their own social baggage that includes their embodied cultural capital that affects the way they experience the game. So on top of what they've been exposed to, it's important to think about, did they play as a kid? What kind of social environment they're coming from? What kind of game were they exposed to? What mechanics are they used to? But also how acceptable is it to play within their social circle? Was it an activity that they were exposed to? And additionally, on top of this, we can see based on social studies, and I have an example of a social study that was made in France specifically on the practice of board game or playing board games, is that you do also have correlation between the practice of playing board games and socioeconomic background. So for example, in France, board game is more prevalent in upper middle class families with kids, and that's really, really a big difference compared to people that are going to be coming from more popular classes or even upper classes where they don't really play with their kids for some reasons. So that's really this idea that that's going to have a big impact. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, especially if you're thinking about designing and bringing games in the classroom, for example, keeping in mind that the students that you're going to have in front of you are going to come from diverse cultural background, but also diverse socioeconomical background, and their relationship to gaming is not going to be equal. You have to be conscious about the fact that even if you're thinking that by using gaming to change the way you approach learning, you have to keep in mind that you're still um, uh, enforcing inequalities that are there already from the beginning in the overall relationship with the game and with learning. So that's something to keep in mind. And on top of that, that's a very lengthy introduction to my first abstract footprint. And that first one is the cultural footprint. And here, the idea is how much does your game relies on your players' ludic cultural capital. So how much does the mechanics are tied to a specific cultural context or maybe subcategories of gaming. So the benefits here is that the more you rely on those mechanics and that cultural capital, what you're making sure is that for the players who have that cultural capital, you're going to lower the cognitive load of learning the game. As I was saying, I was talking about trick taking, and I have an example here. I don't know if you've played Brian Boru. Brian Boru was a very interesting game that was released by Pierre Sylvester, I think earlier this year or late last year, and it relies on trick taking. And for me, learning the game was easier because I was already used to that specific mechanic. It's just that it was presented in a different way. But yeah, so it lowered the cognitive load for me to learn the game specifically. So that's an interesting thing, but keep in mind that those abstract dimensions are going to be different depending on the player. And for a player like me, it lowered it, but maybe that for a player that came from South Korea, it would have maybe increased it. The other benefit is that you can play with conventions. So you can actually have a more interesting conversation with your player. For example, I think Helsinki 1918 is a really good example of that. It's a game that is hex-based. So it looks a lot like hex encounters, and it keeps a lot of the mechanics that you would expect from a hex encounter wargame, but it subverts those mechanics by thinking of different ways about how can you use this convention of using a hex grid on a map. And then you can also popularize a specific cultures. So for example, if you are thinking about, well, I want to make trick taking more popular, maybe a way to make it more popular is to make it more approachable to other audience that haven't been exposed to it. The risk here is that you actually lower the inclusivity for the people who are not exposed, who don't have that capital or don't really have the time to invest in this. And you also participated in community segmentation. So you're strengthening potentially specific tropes or design tropes that are really prevalent within the community. So adding more OCS games to the OCS series is not really opening up hex encounter as an activity to a wider range of players. Example of high footprint, I think Standard Combat Series is a perfect example of that. The game is a bit like OCS, but way simpler. So it's another MMP series that I like a lot. It's a basic operational hex encounter game, and it purely relies on all the classic tropes that you expect from a hex encounter game. The benefit from it is that I open up an SCS game, I read the two pages of special rules for that specific box that I bought, and I'm ready to go. So the lower it's a very low connective load for me to engage with the game. But the problem is that the game is really hard to access for people who haven't been exposed to those conventions. It mostly relies on the cultural capital of the players. But you can play with the footprint quite a lot, and I think it's really interesting to play with it. And I was giving the example of Brian Boru, and I think Brian Boru is a really good example of that. It takes trick taking, but apply it in a very different context. He used trick taking to actually interact with the board, to interact with concepts that are different, like area majority, political influence, and stuff like this. So it does really interesting things with the mechanic and subverts it and use it in different way. And I think, for example, Napoleon's Triumph is also doing this. It looks like a classical area impulse game, but actually the way it uses the convention is very clever. And actually, it feels like playing a card game, but you're not playing tricks. You're actually playing areas in a very interesting way. So there is actually a lot of space in the subversion and the détournement, you could say, of those mechanics to actually do something interesting with it. The second abstract footprint is what I think is the emotional footprint of the game. And that's something that is quite recent for me that I haven't thought about it enough before. And I think there is actually a lot of things to consider here. And here is the potential of the emotional impact that the game is going to provide to the player. And this impact can be positive or negative. And usually, as I said, for all those abstract dimensions, it's tied to the existing relationship that the player has with the topic. So here, I think the benefit is clear. Having a large emotional footprint means that you are going to be able to increase the player involvement within the game. You're going to be able to raise some more complex issues, not mechanically, but maybe more ethically. So you can raise ethical dilemmas in gameplay and convey more complex and maybe more interesting messages about what you're trying to portray. So I think it's really important to show maybe the different bad stuff that are coming into an event, its complexity or the problems that are surrounding it. Like this emotional impact is going to enable you to do a lot of that. The problem that you're risking is, well, you have ethical dilemmas as a designer. Do I want to portray this? Is it really fair for me to introduce that specific topic into my game? What kind of agency I'm giving to the player? So you're going to create a lot of ethical dilemmas for yourself as a designer. For your players, you're going to potentially create a lot of discomfort, and potentially you're going to make resurface existing traumas to your players, maybe in an environment that they didn't expect. Maybe they didn't want the game to create that kind of effect. And that's something that can be very intimate. So it's also a very risky relationship that you're creating with the player, and you need to be really sure about what you're going for. I think a really good example of high emotional footprint is This War of Mine, but there are a lot of other games. And I would say that, interestingly, over the last couple of decades, the emotional footprint of the games have grown larger and larger, and in an interesting way most of the time. And the way you can play with that footprint is, if you want to lower it, usually abstraction is going to be the way to go. So you're going to hide complex or difficult topic but behind an abstraction or just a mechanic. But then if you want to increase it, what you can do is artwork, flavor text, and stuff like this. And usually what I would say is, the more you individualize things within the game, the more the emotional footprint is going to be increasing. And here I have a really clear example of what I'm meaning by this. So I have this game, I don't know if you've played it. It's called Days of Ire here. It's a game about the insurrection in '56 in Budapest. And in this game, you actually have assets on the board for the players who are playing the insurgent players. And those assets or other insurgents that they can recruit and activate. And all of those insurgents have different benefits. But what the designers have decided to do is that they gave them a silhouette, so you can see that you're playing a specific individual. And interestingly, they gave all of those insurgents a name that is inspired by the name of people who were actually taking part in that insurrection in Budapest in 1956. So actually, you create, those are just components. They could be standardized. You could have only those two icons on it. The fact that you add a silhouette and a name on it, well, it creates a stronger thematic tie between your mechanics and its aesthetics. So that makes the experience more immersive. But you're also creating something like more of a sort of personal attachment, you could say, with the with those objects. They're not that abstract anymore. And another good example that I have here, and maybe just to illustrate this, because I think the idea of the emotional footprint is something that that I think is interesting. There's another game called No Motherland Without, a very interesting game. And something that is really interesting that Dan Bullock did here is that a key aspect of his game is working on a generational map. And those are people that are in North Korea. And you actually have a whole gameplay between the different players about trying to have some of those people escape North Korea. And the fact that you can actually see their faces is creating an experience that is radically different than what you would find in other types of game where you're just looking for area majority. You can actually put faces on actions that you're taking as a player. So those are example of how you can play with the emotional footprint, and just to illustrate how you can alter this within the overall experience. And then the last one of those abstract footprints, and that's probably the most obvious one, but I would say probably one of the hardest one to define, and that's the cognitive footprint. So here the idea is to think about what is the cognitive load that you're putting on the player for them to be able to engage with your game. So you have to take into account everything here, learning the rules, the game complexity, and its depth. And I'm making a difference between the complexity of the game and the depth, and I will talk a bit more about this later. But here, increasing the cognitive load has quite a few benefits. First of all, you increase the decision-making space, which I think is something that can be extremely interesting in terms of game design, especially when we're thinking about portraying and constructing historical model, whether they're military, political. I think increasing the decision-making space make it more interesting and make it more engaging for players to interact with the subject matter of the game. But you can also enable the designer to make more complex historical models. So you actually have more space to represent things that are more complex and more interesting. The risk that you're creating by doing this is that, first of all, and that's something that if you've done a lot of playtests, you're going to see is that the more complex you make your game, the more you increase the opportunity for players to make mistakes when they're interacting with the game. The cognitive load is directly negatively correlated to the number of game properly played within playtest, but also potentially with any other players. And that's also a problem because as a designer, you want players to interact with your game properly. You want them to play them by the rules so they can actually interact with the game as intended. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you're going to increase the analysis paralysis phenomenon. So actually interacting with your game is going to be more complex. For some of your players, it's going to be too much. And then again, we don't come also with the same ability or possibility to interact with with games that have very high cognitive load. And then you also have the risk of introducing a lot of edge cases within your rules that are always a lot of issues. So you might actually break the immersion because you have to go back to the rule book, find if someone asked the question on BGG already and did the designer answer properly and stuff like this. I think the typical example of high footprint for cognitive load is Advanced Squad Leader, where you have rules for a lot of different edge cases. It's very complex. You have a lot of fluff, you have a lot of details, and this is typically something that can make the game really hard to grasp, and you feel like, it's very hard to engage with. You can play with the footprint in a lot of different ways. So as I was saying, abstraction can also be a way to make things simpler and stuff like this. But let's say you do have the footprint as it is and you want to have the game as complex as it is. The other way that you can play with it is that you can actually make the perception of the footprint, make the perceived perception lower. And you can do this by providing proper player aids, well-made player aids that helps actually internalize the rules within the gameplay and limit the distraction of having to go from the rule book to actually interacting with the board. You can really work on the UI of your board, making sure that all of the edge cases or the things that are important to remember are straight in front of the player space for the players. You can use the components, you can use cards. Cards are actually a great way to have a lot of edge cases and a lot of complexity that you want to bring to your game by having cards. You could say that each card in a card-driven game is a specific rule that you don't have to remember. And the other way that you can do also is, if you're thinking about segmenting your game, we're talking about different scenarios and stuff like this earlier, you can also have segmented rule sets. So you could divide the experience that you're proposing to the players in different layers. And ASL is a perfect example of that. You don't learn all of the ASL rules at once. You actually learn maybe first the few basic units, and then you have a few scenarios about this. You have the starter kit number 1, and those are the units that you learn. And then you add things on top of this. And they say, oh, I want to know how to use vehicles. I want to use how to use mortar. And then you actually increment slowly but steadily actually the number of the amount of complexity that you're comfortable with the game. But it's the player's choice to decide where to stop and where to continue. And then you have a lot of different things, tutorials, intro scenarios, and all those stuff. Actually, you have a lot of games, and it's also more and more prevalent today to actually have learning styles in the rulebook, where you're going to have a section of the rulebook that's going to teach you how to play scenario from 1 to 10. You're going to play, have fun, and then you're going to have extra rules to actually start playing other scenarios in the future. So that's also a good way to not lower the footprint itself, but actually make the perception of that footprint a bit less daunting for your players. The thing that I want to say about the cognitive load is the problem is that not all of the complexity comes from the richness or the interest of the decision space that is provided to the players. I think there is an economy of complexity within game design, and that's something that as a designer, we need to think about a lot. And because I think that within the game, complexity comes from two things. There is the game's decision space, so all the different potential valuable options that you can take at a specific turn, and thinking about those and the repercussion is actually the game's decision space, and a lot of complexity comes from that. But then a lot of the complexity can come from the game's bureaucracy. So what happens if I do this? What happens in that step? What is the consequence of orientation of my counter on that hex? And all of those things. And what I'm thinking about is when you're thinking about the economy of your complexity is what you're trying to optimize is the ratio between the number of meaningful decisions that you're giving the players to make compared to the number of actions they have to take with the game. The more meaningful decisions to the lower amount of actions taken, the more you're optimizing the economy of the complexity of your game. In the case of historical design, there is always that complexity that you want to add edge case and specific things, but I think we have to really think critically about those things and think about really strongly about the economy of the complexity that we're introducing for in the games to make sure that the way we use that cognitive load is used for good purpose, I would say. And then one last thing around complexity, something that I think we need probably to keep in mind, and that's the concept of game refinement. So that's coming from an article that's called Analyzing Thousands-Year-Old Game, and it was published in the Asia Pacific Journal of Information and Technology and Multimedia. And what it's looking at is a game that is really prevalent in major parts of India called Tigers and Goats. It's an abstract game, asymmetric abstract game, really interesting game. And this game has known a lot of different regional variants. What the article is analyzing is you have competing different variants of the same game. And what they're analyzing is which variant survived compared to the others. So you have a bit of that, like almost a genetical analysis to understand, okay, those are the different variants. Which one, how do they spread? How did they survive? How long were they actually in practice in the different areas of the country? And what they realized, and it's really interesting, is that they came up with an indicator that they call game refinement. And they realized that the level of game refinement was a good indicator of the probability of a game to survive compared to its competitor variant. And if you are interested in the formula, game refinement is the square root of the average possible move at each step of the game divided by the average length of the game. So this is the GR number that you have here on the right-hand side. And you can see that you have different game refinement indicators for different game. And actually what they saw is that the variant of Tigers and Goats that survived was the one that had the highest game refinement. So proposing the most interesting decisions to the player. So actually complexity can be rewarding, can be more engaging. The problem is that here, if you're thinking about Goats and Ladder, every decision is meaningful. You don't have a lot of processes, like you're not really thinking about your orientation or which hex vertex you're facing or those kind of things. Like you're really purely just making pure moves. So something to think about. That being said, so I said a lot of things about, in theory, this is what I think are the different footprints and the thing that you can do and play with it and all that. But I didn't want it to leave it to that. What I wanted to do is to think about, okay, those are those ideas about what is the game design footprint. But can we evaluate this? And can we use this as a tool to evaluate games, but also think about our own design? And here, what you're going to see is just a pure proposal. I'm not saying it's perfect in any way or at all. Actually, I think that I just want it to be the basis of a discussion, but I think it could be really interesting to try to refine this idea. So what I came up with is based on those 6 dimensions of the game design footprint. What I proposed is a very basic footprint measurement matrix. So you have the 3 material footprints on the left-hand side, the 3 abstract footprints on the right-hand side, and then you have a scale from 1 to 5, and a bit of an explanation of, for each of those footprints, what 1 means, what 2 means, etc., etc. So for example, if we think temporal footprint, you're going to score a 1 if the game score less than 30 minutes, a 2 if it's between 30 and 60, etc., etc., up to 240 plus. And some of them are more or less complex. So I'm trying also to keep it pretty tangible. So if I'm thinking about the social footprint, for example, a 1 is going to be a solo, cheap a game with low involvement. So that's going to be a low social footprint. And a high social footprint for a game is going to be something that requires more than 3 players, that is expensive, that requires storage, and has a high involvement or a lot of interactions. Same thing, some of those can be hard to define, but keeping this idea, the lowest part of the scale for the cultural footprint would be it's only using very common mechanics that everyone is used to. So basic use of play cards, rolling dice, stuff like this, that will have a low cultural footprint. High cultural footprint would be games that refer or rely directly on the awareness of the player of a specific subculture. So do they know the hex encounter conventions? Do they know the PAX game conventions? Do they know the con game conventions? Like all of those different things. Or is my game going to rely a lot on this to actually make it easy for players to engage with the game? The one that I'm not really happy with, especially, is the cognitive one. So what I use now is I base it on the BGG scale that rates game complexity from 1 to 5. And 1 is being light, 5 is being heavy, and everything in the middle. But I think there is probably something more interesting to come up with a more quantitative approach. And I think there is maybe something that could be around, well, calculating the game refinement that I mentioned a bit earlier, but also potentially have a way to evaluate the length of the rules. So the number of information points that you're providing to the players. Like if you're thinking about rules as lines of codes, for example, how many specific conditions and effects and mechanics you're providing to the player. So thinking about something more in that realm. And that could actually make it possible to also think about that complexity economy that I was talking about, thinking about the ratio between meaningful decisions and the game bureaucracy, for example. So thinking about something around this would make it probably more interesting. But for now, I just had that BGG scale. And I made that measurement matrix just to say, this is how it could work. And then I wanted to apply it to a few games just to give a few examples of what it could potentially look like. So here I have a few examples, and I picked 4 games that were quite different in the footprints that they're proposing. You have Watergate on one hand. So for those who don't know, Watergate is a game on Watergate. So one player is playing Nixon, the other player is playing the journalist. And it's a very small, simple, card-driven game that plays in half an hour, very easy to engage to. So that's the first one. The second one is a game that I just mentioned called Days of Ire, a pretty accessible game about Budapest in 1956. The third one is my first love, Twilight Struggle, which is a bigger card-driven game about the Cold War, so from the end of the Second World War up to the collapse of the USSR. And the last one is a very large hex encounter game by Mark Herman called Pacific War. And here you can see that based on the matrix that I'm providing is that you can actually evaluate the footprint of all of those games. So one of them is the one that you see on the outside. The yellow one is Pacific War. You can see very high cognitive footprint, very high spatial footprint, extremely high temporal footprint, requires a lot of social interaction, engagement from the people you're going to play with, and it requires on very high cultural footprint. So you do expect from players to have quite a lot of understanding, or for them to actually start to understand a lot of conventions that they were not necessarily exposed to. The emotional footprint is quite lower. That being said, it can be really different, especially if you're a veteran from that war. But then again, the level of abstraction is so high that maybe the emotional involvement is still pretty low. So this is to give a bit of an overview. So you have on one hand Pacific War, and on the other, if you look in red, you have Watergate. And Watergate is actually a lot lower. So you can see very low spatial footprint, very low cognitive footprint. And that's really interesting because then you can actually quantify those footprints, because if you calculate the area of each of those, you can actually have an actual number for the footprint of each game, and potentially something that designers can use within the context of them designing the game to evaluate their footprint as they go. So that's the idea. Now that this is being said, as I was saying, for each of the footprint discussion that I was talking about, I said that there were different ways that the designers could use to actually play with the footprint. And an example for that is Pacific War. So Pacific War is a very good illustration for me to show that effect that a footprint is not definitive. You can actually play around it. And you have the original footprint that I'm showing, so the full Pacific War experience that I was talking about. And then you actually have the lower footprint that you can have with Pacific War. And the thing is that Pacific War as a game within the box is not providing you with a single experience. What it's proposing is actually a lot of different variants of the same game, and proposes a lot of different ways for the players to interact with. And that's going to have a major impact on the footprint. So you have two things. You have the footprint of the game, but also its plasticity that we can potentially evaluate. And that will be the area that can be moved on the ratio of the area that it covers as a whole. That will give the indication of the plasticity of the footprint. That's a hard word to say. The way it does that is the spatial footprint is altered in a lot of different ways. The main way that it does it is that you have multiple maps that are present within the box, so you don't have to set up a whole game to actually interact with the game. You can set up a smaller map for a specific subset of scenarios. Temporal footprint, same way. You have a lot of scenarios. You can play a game in 30 to 45 minutes. Or you can play a more engaged game that can last for maybe a few hours, up to something that can last for potentially, sorry, 20, 30 hours if you want to go really crazy on this. And in the same way, in a very, I would say, pretty smart way, the new version of Pacific War, I don't know if the 1985 version was doing this, but the latest version that was released is doing that, is that it's also playing a lot with the cognitive footprint, in the sense that it layered its rules depending on the type of scenario that you want to play, and it divided the types of interaction you can have in the game in 3 different layers. You can play an engagement, you can play a battle, or you can play an operation. Engagement is the smaller component. I'm really sorry. And each of them have specific rule books. So if you want to only play an engagement, you only have to engage with that rule book. You only have to learn this. If you have to teach it, you only have to teach that part. And then you can gradually build the experience. So as you can see, even if it's a game with a very high footprint, even on its lowest setting, you could say, it's still very plastic. So that's something that I wanted to stress, and also something to keep in mind as designers. And then there is one thing that I would like to talk about in conclusion, and I think that's also something to think about, is the 2 great directions or current that you can see that are behind wargame design specifically, naturalism versus realism. And keep in mind that I think those 2 ways of seeing war games is also going to have a major impact on game design footprints. So I'm taking this from a 1977 article that was published in Moves magazine, so a very cult war game magazine from the 70s and the 80s. And it had this article in that issue number 31 about, so it was written by Redmond Simonsen, and talking about what he sees are 2 different currents in war game design. The first one is naturalism. So the idea is to capture the symptoms of truth, and that's really trying to. So the people who might say that they are making simulations, extremely detailed games and stuff like this, they're going to be more naturalist, and they're going to have a naive approach to what they think is adding more details is going to make the game more realistic, and that might not necessarily be the case. And by doing this, they're going to increase dramatically their footprint, and in my opinion, maybe not for the best. And on the other side, you've got to have another current that is more Richard is calling a realism. And here the idea is to capture the essence of the truth and use abstraction to convey ideas about the event and how they unfolded, rather than what he calls historical decorations. So this distinction affects the footprint and I think the economy. you have to think about those two things as not two perfect categories, but more as a spectrum that a designer can go from one end to another, and that a game can be somewhere in the middle. But something to think about, and I would really recommend reading the article. But my view still is that the more you're going to go, and I realize that I wrote that wrong, the more you're going to go toward realism, the more you're going to optimize the footprint of your game. And that was maybe an opening to look back in the past into old articles from old magazine and realize that they still have a lot of super interesting things to say about modern game design, even if they were written at an era where a lot of the games that we're playing now don't exist. It's still super relevant. So that was it for my presentation. I would like to give a few thanks to a few people that actually helped me or inspired me in making that presentation. The first one is actually, I think here, Joe Dewhurst, that was just here for making sure sanity checks, making sure that I didn't make too many mistakes and that what I was writing in my presentation was sensible. So thanks a lot to him. I would like also to thanks Gian Maria from Ludovox, who actually helped me coming up with that idea of game design sedimentation. So it started from a conversation that we had together, and then he mentioned a philosopher called Husserl and talked about this concept, and it actually helped me refine that idea. Another person that I would like to thank is Niels Johansson, the game graphic designer, that has this massive collection of old school articles from Moves and a lot of different magazines. And he shared with me a lot of cool stuff that inspired me during the process of making the presentation. And the last person that I want to thank is Saverio Spagnoli, one of the designer of Vija Nagara, who also shared more the academic side of that presentation. So the article about game refinement comes from him, and having discussed with him about those things actually inspired a lot of my thinking around those topics. So as I said, it's just the beginning of a reflection. I'm just putting it out there. It's very imperfect. There are probably a lot of holes to poke around into those intuitions and everything. But I think it's an interesting topic for us to think about when we're thinking about how we want to create game experiences in the classroom or with players, but also in the way we create games and all this. And yeah, just wanted to put out there, give food for thoughts, and hear what people think about it. But that's it for me. So I haven't looked at the questions, but my hope is that Sebastian, you already know exactly
Yeah.
what I have to
So,
answer. Yeah.
so Fred, no worries. I have all the questions. We have a couple questions first, and I'll start from the first one that says, this person says, I work in education and often use war games. Most are insurgency based, but always becomes bogged down with learning the rules versus understanding the abstract, which is what we were trying to get to. My difficulty is how to balance the pure abstract with relatively little mechanics in their learning environment. I'm thinking I'm using cards for the students to do something, say send a sensor to an area, but that's as far as I got. Any suggestions in wargaming in the learning environment?
So here, I think it's already intuitively the person who has the question as, for me, I think a really good intuition. And I think that using cards to simplify the relationship with the game is a really good way to approach it. Like you have a card that tells you to do something, meaning that in a way, the action and the rule for the action is written in front of the player. It's in their first player space. It's in their hand. So it's really literally in front of them. And not even on the board, which is another space that can be harder to reach. So I think that's making the rules closer to the player and closer to the actions that they're taking is one thing. The other thing that is really useful to help the cognitive load, and that's going to come from the designer, but also the people facilitating the game can do a lot of that, is actually when I was talking about the NDA approach, the thing is that a good game, especially in our environment, is gonna use the aesthetics to inform the dynamic and the mechanics. So as much as possible, make sure that there are strong thematic ties that can explain why something is happening. And I think that you're creating sort of a lot of mini mnemonic devices for the players to understand if they can make that thematic tie between a mechanic and the theme. Actually remembering the rules is going to be way easier than just saying when you do this, this happens and this happens and this happens. Like if it becomes a part of the storytelling, well, the process of remembering it and understanding it is going to be widely different. So those are the two things that I would think about, but there are probably a lot more.
So the next question says, do you see a difference in the type of games that families and friends at different income levels might play together, such as trending topics? I imagine the use of games like Catan might appeal to a lower income audience because they are more readily available, visible, and more likely to be cheaper.
Yeah, so I think there is a massive impact of the social structures on your gaming experience. It forms in different way. The first one, the obvious one, is the income. How much money, how much like available income do you have to spare to buy a game? That's going to be the first thing. The second thing is where you live. And I think where you live informs a lot of things around what you can buy. What are you actually exposed to in your daily life? What do you see when you're going in the street and everything? And here that might be also maybe from a very European perspective, we walk a lot around our cities and stuff like this. But of course, what you're going to be exposed to is going to be pretty different. How much free time do you have, and how do you spend that free time is going to be important. Who are you going to be exposed to? If you're exposed to people that all have academic backgrounds and everything, well, their interests are going to be widely different, and you're going to be exposed just from conversations, from friendship and everything to a lot of different things. So yes, socioeconomical structure influence a lot the relationship or the type of game that you're going to interact with. It's not, in essence, someone that has low income is not going to be interested in something. Is that their opportunity to interact with something is going to be limited, or going to have to go through a lot more hurdles.
So the next question says, for the measurements, are you going for objective footprint size or footprint size for a specific market segment? Players with tarot experience, for example.
Yeah, so that's the thing that is a bit tricky with the measurement is, as I was saying, the material footprint is usually pretty tangible and tied to the game. The abstract one can be slightly different, or usually very different from player to player. So that can make it hard to evaluate. But if you look back, what I'm trying to do is the measurement matrix here is to think about how much does it rely on something specific. So for example, the cultural one is, if you want to look at it from a game perspective, you're going to think, okay, how much does this game design relies on understanding trick taking, for example? It doesn't say anything around the fact that for a specific player, when they're going to look at the footprint, it's going to be different for them. But in essence, for the game, how much does it rely on the knowledge of those different cultural contexts? This is going to inform the footprint of the game. But those abstract footprints are going to be perceived differently from a player point of view. So that's the idea behind it.
So do the 6 vectors of the footprint have different swing weights or values?
So I kept them exactly the same way. So for me, they don't have, at this stage. I didn't do any weighting. So they were all evaluated the same way from a scale from 1 to 5 based on that measurement matrix. But I think maybe it could be interesting to see if they could have different weights, and then in that sense, then the core footprint would be radically different. But you could say, for example, that cognitive and social should be more important than emotional and spatial. I think that's an interesting question. I didn't really consider it. At this stage, I wanted just something that is pretty straightforward. 6 footprints, 6 values, and evaluate the areas of each of those footprints and how plastic they are is where I am at now. But I'm really open to the idea of potentially weighting it.
So the next question says, as someone fairly new to war games in the broad sense, I've noticed that designers and players seem to be really comfortable directly building on existing systems or modes. I think of the PAX or the Coin or the Hex War games where all this associated gameplay language already inherited from other games in the system. Why do you think this is? Is it to allow dense historical scope to be applied since the bones are already in a certain player's vocabulary, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think there are different reasons for that. First of all, I don't think that it's specific to war games. I think that if you play enough game and when you start to and are exposed to a wide range of mechanics and game experience, then each time you're going to open up a new game that is supposed to be innovative and do crazy stuff, you're going to realize that, oh, this is actually a variant of that, or this is a variant of this. So I would say that I don't say that innovation doesn't exist. I just think that innovation is probably a lot smaller than what we think it is in game design. And that's probably one of the reasons why it's such a great idea that you cannot patent game mechanic, because nothing can exist without all of the games that came before it. So I think this already exists. what happens in wargaming, and relating to that specific question that we have here, is that wargame designers tend to use families or systems, and that's really true. And I think the reason for that is, as the person asking the question said, and I think they are right, is that it makes it so that you can make really complex game, but with a low bar of entry for people who actually already know the game. And it also makes the investment from a player perspective to learn a system more valuable. Like, you have a higher return on investment to learn how to play a con game, because once you've learned how to play a con game, suddenly a wide range of game can open up to you. You can play 10 different games, and a lot of them are going to come in the future. I think it's the same, for example, Commands and Colors, perfect example of that. You've learned one Commands and Colors game, and there were actually, I don't know, I think a dozen on different publishers. So I think that, I don't remember, but you've got Days of, like Memoir 44, so it's Days of Wonder, I think, something like this. I know that Compass is also releasing some Commands and Colors games. GMT is also releasing them. Once you've learned the Commands and Color core system, once you open a new box, well, your investment for learning the original one is actually very valuable, because you just have to learn, okay, what are the variants for that specific game, and you're ready to go. So I think in that sense, it enables designer to make really complex game based on an infrastructure that makes their games more accessible, but it makes also the design process way simpler, because like coming up with the first con game must have been, I think, for Volko, quite a, a bigger challenge maybe than the designers that came afterwards. Like, making that backbone structure is can require a lot of investment and a lot of work, and being able not to start again from scratch actually enables designer to explore a wide variety of topic, just by focusing on altering and playing around a core system that already exists. So I think that's, but I just want to say that yes, that's the case, but it's not necessarily that different from what you see in the rest of the board game industry. And then the example of PAX, I think, is interesting, because if you play a lot of PAX game, the more you play them, the more it's hard to figure out why they are a series, because actually mechanically they can be very different from one to another. And I would say that what makes them a series is more of an aesthetics than a common set of mechanics and dynamics. And I think that it's really interesting, this idea that you have those complex systems that can be mechanical series, but I think in the context of PAX is more of an aesthetical series of game. Even if some of the mechanics can be quite common, there is always exception within the series, which I think is quite interesting.
So a question for the graph that you have up, comparing the footprints. As designers or even as players, how can we consider, have you seen any connections or relationships between the various poles of the circle that you have there? For example, the spatial interact with cultural, or social engage with the cognitive?
So on this, the only thing that, and once again, it's really based on intuition, is what I expect is that spatial, temporal, and social will have a tendency to be highly correlated together. Not always, but especially spatial and temporal. But seeing if they are maybe having a correlation matrix between those would be interesting to analyze. But I think for us to be able to do that, what we'll have to do is probably evaluate the footprint of a sample of games, probably at least a few hundreds, just to see if we can start actually thinking about, okay, do we see negative or positive correlation between those two? And actually, what would be interesting, what I'm thinking is it would be interesting to see if we can see clusters of game also more interestingly. So something to consider. But for us to be able to do that analysis, I think that evaluating a lot more games to create a database of those games, to being able to do those statistical analysis, would be necessary first. And as you can see, I've only done 4 games, so that's not enough.
So to build on that question, as you sort of said, intuition indicates what you think is chunking together or have relationships to. Based on your own experience and also your own sort of intuition as you're preparing for this presentation, is that what insights or trends or advice do you have from thinking about games in these sort of 6 dimensions?
So I think there is an interesting question about the trends, and I think when I'm thinking about it, is that I've seen quite a few trends for each of those for a few of those dimensions. The first one is the emotional trend. I feel like over the last couple of decades, we've increased the emotional footprints of our game. And I think that's probably linked to the industry becoming more and more mature, and thinking about more critically about what it's depicting, and thinking that, well, that emotional footprint is actually necessary. You cannot just take any topic and start to play with it. And I think uh, uh, a good example of that is the re-edition of Puerto Rico, for example. Like, you have quite a lot of trends of those German Euro games with cubes that were depicting pretty awful things in a very abstract manner that had a very low emotional footprint, but actually what it was depicting deserved a lot more consideration. So I think that's one of the things. The other thing that I kind of see is on the cognitive side, and that might have existed for quite a while. I was giving the example of ASL, and it was a bit of the system originally. And I think you could argue also that some role-playing games also work in the same way. You don't have to run all of the rules to being able to play. But there are a lot more and more, I feel, ways to actually try to lower the cognitive load. But overall, I think games are becoming more complex, or the range of complex game is always increasing. Like, there is a lot of complex game that get bought by a lot of different people. That might have already been the case in the 70s and the 80s. Then we had the video games, but I feel like this is coming back. But now it's coming back with a conscious effort by publishers and designers to make that cognitive load easier to interact with as player, or more gradual, like making the learning curve a bit less steep. So those are two things that I think are happening more recently. And then on the cultural side, I think it's the nature of the industry. But yes, games. I think there is something interesting that I see is more and more games are actually using very well-known conventions and applying them to a different context. A friend of mine was talking to me about a role-playing game. I think it was a solo role-playing game about witch trials in the US in the 17th and 18th century, that use the Jenga tower to resolve some of the actions and stuff like this. And I think it's really interesting that you see more and more of well-known conventions being applied in different contexts and used in different ways. And this is also an interesting trend that I see. I was talking about Brian Boru also, and ARCS is going to come soon in May. I don't know if it's next year or the year after that, the latest game by Cole Werle that actually uses trick-taking mechanic to actually power a 4X game. So I think that's also something that we're going to see trends of, is taking a very well-known mechanic and actually subvert it to do something else with it. And I went on that tangent about trends, but I'm not sure I'm answering the answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. So there is a question buried in a comment, which is, what is the market for smaller footprint war games like Blitzkrieg and Caesar by Paulo Mori, which two games which I just bought like this weekend?
Awesome games, both of them. And just I want to say it's crazy because those games have the same engine, you could say, in a lot of ways, but it uses it in such different ways that it's crazy how very small differences can create such radical different experiences. And I think there is a very large market for lower footprints historical games. And I think that's great for multiple reasons, because I think I don't think that as designer we should always think of those games as gateway to something else. Like, experiencing those games are great in of themselves. Like, you don't need to think about, Rome is great, but it's great because it's opening you to playing I don't know what uh, um, other game. I think it's really interesting because I'm happy that board games as a cultural medium is engaging more and more with history, and I'm happy that it's doing it more and more in a thoughtful way. So I think that's great, and I think that playing is it's just yeah, I think it's a very positive activity, and I think doing it while learning about history or engaging with it is something that is really positive. And then of course I still have that hope that once you play something like this, you might be also interested in playing something different, a bit heavier, and engage maybe a bit more with more serious historical gaming. But actually, to show you that, yeah, I think it's interesting that it opens up and shows to a wider range of players that gaming is actually a legitimate way to interact with history. And I think that's what those games are doing, on top of being just very fun games that you can play with everyone.
So, semi-related to your presentation is, as you have designed your own games, what have you learned or evolved as a designer through that process?
That's a really good question. I think I've so the thing that the first game that I made, Red Flag Over Paris, I already had that idea of design footprints and the fact that I wanted to optimize the footprint of that design. It's just that I didn't went through that process. That like I didn't see those 6 different dimensions back then. Some of them were more in the back of my mind, more intuitive, and were there already. But I was already thinking about reducing it. I just would have wished that I maybe had spent more time in thinking about it more fully. But I was already thinking about that. What I was mostly focusing on was reducing the, you could say, more the material footprints. I wanted the game to be able to be bought by a wider audience, because I wanted more people to be able to have access to it. I wanted the game to be quite small, to be so it doesn't take too much space, and it can be easy to play and can be easy to bring to the table and not be too daunting, and making sure that it can be played with in a short time. I think where I missed a bit the mark is that I didn't realize, I didn't fully understand at the beginning, up until probably the end of my design process for Red Flag Over Paris, that actually it relied a lot on the cultural ludic capital of my players. It was very easy to play, and the connective load was low and everything, and it felt like it was narrow, but it was only narrow if you came from playing Twilight Struggle, which I was. So when I was thinking about my game, I was like, wow, that game is so simple. But then when I started playtesting it with people who never played any historical games, I realized that, well, my small 10 pages of rule and my simple system was actually not that simple, and those 10 pages of rule could feel very daunting. And it made me realize through that process that there was a, I think what my game design experience gave me is a better understanding of the level of asymmetry that you have between designer and player, but also of the level of asymmetry that can exist among players, and it made me reflect on that. So in that sense, I think that maybe Red Flag Over Paris misses the mark when it comes to its original ambition of narrowing the footprint as much as possible. It did well in some aspects, not that much in others, because maybe I hadn't refined my thought process around it. And I'm thinking about doing this for future games, and the next games that I'm going to do is the clear ambition of making the footprint as narrow as possible while still making a compelling and interesting historical argument. I think is going to be more interesting for me as a designer, because I would have thought that through a lot more. So yeah, I think that that would be the difference. And also one thing that I'm thinking a lot more and more about is that emotional footprint. That is not really something that I really thought about at all. That I think is something that I should consider, but also something that as a designer I should feel comfortable playing around with.
Absolutely. I think it sort of goes back to the point that one of the other questions raised about system and modes, or even the vocabulary that we use. And as designers, we're so used to working in those verbs and concepts that sometimes we distill really complex things down to something like zones of control or something like that. So
Yeah.
absolutely. As I wait for other questions to sort of filter in, I want to thank you one last time before we end our session here. For sharing your presentation with us and your experiences. I learned a lot. I know I will be thinking about this even when I teach game design to my students here at Georgetown. So I'll wait a few more seconds before we end our session. But for those who need to know, this will be posted up on our YouTube page later today. And the materials, after Fred sends them to me, will be posted on our Google Drive, which can be accessed through our newsletter via our website. But otherwise, thank you, Fred, and hopefully you have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks again for the opportunity, and I would like to thank the people in the chat for the super interesting question. And I just saw that there was a Peter Perla in the chat, so it's good that I didn't realize that before. I think it would have made me super nervous, but no, it was really great, great chat, and I hope that it inspires some of you to think about those things. And once again, as I said, I would be very happy to keep on having this conversation. You can find me on Twitter when it's still working, I guess. I also put my email address in here, but yeah, you can also reach out on BGG or on YouTube or maybe other platforms in the future. But it was great to have that opportunity to discuss all of this with you. I hope you find this useful, and I would be very keen on keeping on that conversation and try to refine this idea of game design footprint.